Hi, it's Chris P. Williams here. I hope you're well. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at colouring a black and white image within Affinity Photo. And before we start, I just want you to click on the white circle in the colour palette. I then want you to select a colour just by left clicking in this rectangular palette. I've selected blue. And now I want you to press D on your keyboard. Now you can see with mine, they've now returned to black and white is a default state. If yours doesn't turn back to black and white, don't worry, we just need to set up a shortcut. And to do that, we just need to go to Edit, Preferences, Keyboard Shortcuts, File drop-down, scroll all the way down to the bottom and select Miscellaneous. And we're looking at this Set Fill to Black and White. If this box is empty, just left-click and type D, and then press Close. We've now created a shortcut. So if we left click now on any colour in our colour palette, you can see that's turned blue. By pressing D, it returns to our default state of black and white. And this is going to be very useful when we start editing masks later on. Okay, we can now start looking at adding some colour to this picture of John. And the first thing we need to do is to make sure the image is truly black and white, i.e. it's grayscale. The reason for this is a lot of black and white images have got tones or little subtle tones that we can't quite see. And to get rid of these, we're going to use a hue, saturation and luminosity adjustment layer. So go into our layers palette. At the bottom, we see this little white and black circle labeled adjustments. Just left click on that and scroll up to HSL, which is abbreviation for hue, saturation and luminosity. And we're only interested in this saturation shift slider. So left click on the node in the middle and drag it to the left. And this removes any color tones in our image. So we can now click on the little star in the top right corner of the tool to close it. And if we right click on the HSL adjustment layer, to just press right click and scroll down to merge down, we can bake that effect into our photograph. And this is a starting basis of coloring the photo. Right, the next step we need to do is to identify what colours we're going to be using in our image. And in this case, we've got the blue of John's shirt. I might make the hat and the waistcoat the same colour, so I might use a brown. We've got a background, we've got skin, and we've got John's eyes. So let's start with selecting a colour to colour the hat and waistcoat. So just double click on the white coloured circle on our colour palette. Using the hue slider, I'm going to drag it to an orange tone, and from there I can select a suitable brown colour. If you look at this little tile in the top right corner, that indicates the colour that we're actually selecting. And once we've found a colour we're happy with, we can just press close. And you can see now that the white circle has turned brown. Okay, we now need to apply this colour to our image. And to do this, we're going to use a shape tool. If we go to the toolbar on the left, and scroll down to this little rectangle tool and just left click and hold. You can see here we've got a list of different shapes. Not all the shapes have to be rectangular, but in this case we do need a rectangle tool. So it's going to scroll up to the rectangle tool and let go with my mouse, and that's now selected. If I left click in the top left corner of my image, just outside the image itself, I'm going to left click and hold and then drag down to the bottom right corner. Now our image has disappeared, and that's because this is a solid colour, so we need to change the blend mode. And to do this, we're going to go to this drop down menu, currently labelled normal. And if we left click on the little arrow, we get a selection of blend modes. Now don't worry too much about these blend modes. I've done tutorials on my channel about all of these. The only one we're interested in now is the soft light. So just left click on soft light, and we can see now that the photograph of John has reappeared. You can also see that the brown colour has been applied to the whole of the photograph, and that's not what we want. We only want to apply it to the waistcoat and the hat. To do this, we need to make a selection of the waistcoat and hat. And before I proceed, I'm going to rename my rectangle layer to hat. And we can turn this off for the time being. So returning to our background layer, by left clicking the background layer, you can see it's now highlighted blue. We can now start making a selection of the hat and waistcoat. We're going to use the selection brush tool to make this selection. It's the fourth tool down on the left. or you can press W on the keyboard. And you can see now we've got this little circular brush. If we use our left and right square brackets, we can alter the size of this brush. The right square bracket increases the size and the left square bracket decreases. So I'm going to press the right square bracket to increase that brush size slightly, and I'm going to start painting over John's hat. You can see here we've selected an area we didn't intend to. So if you press Alt and left click, that would deselect that area. I missed this little corner on John's hat, so I'm going to let go of the Alt key and just left click to select. And if we press Control and using the scroll wheel on our mouse, we can zoom in. So press Control and scroll. You can see this area has been selected incorrectly. So I'm going to reduce my brush size using the left square bracket, press Alt and delete that area of selection. Now if I press the space bar, you can see the cursor turns into a hand, and keeping my finger on the space bar, I can now left click and drag around my image. I can drag up, down, left, right. And you can see here there's a little bit of John's hat we've missed. So making sure we're not pressing the Alt key this time, just a left key on our mouse, we can select that area of hat. And again, I'm going to press the space bar and just drag over the image, checking for little errors. You can see here we've missed a rim of hat, so just left click and drag to add that. Press the space bar. A little bit of hat missing here, so again just drag to include that. And press Control and 0 on our keyboard to zoom out. We can now start adding our waistcoat. So just left click over the waistcoat and drag to include that in our selection. Again, I've added a bit of shirt in error, so we press Alt and drag over that area of shirt. You can see it's removed from our selection. A good tip here is to drag, left click and let go, left click and let go. Just basically selecting small areas at a time. That just allows you to use the Control and Z on your keyboard, which is undo. So if you do make a little error, press Control and Z and return back to a previous state. And that's looking good to me. And now we can look at the other side of the waistcoat. So just left click and drag. So if I zoom in on his shoulder of John, press the Alt key, left click and drag, just to remove that bit of background. So Control and 0 to zoom out. So once you've got a rough selection, we can click on the Refine button in the top toolbar. What I like to do is go to the Preview drop down, left click and select White Matte, and that gives me a better idea of what I've actually selected. And you can see here there's little areas that have been added to my selection which I don't want. So to remove those, I'm going to go to click on the Background button. So you can see here we've got matte, foreground and background. And I'm going to increase my brush size slightly. And I'm just going to paint over those patches just to remove them. And I think that's looking good to me. Whilst I'm here, I'm also going to feather the selection by clicking on the feather slider and just moving it to the right. Around 3 should do the job. And once we're happy, we can just press Apply. Now you can spend a little bit more time on that selection, just refining it and making it as best you can. But in my case, I'm going to load a selection I made earlier. And we can move on to the next stage. Right, the next thing we need to do is to apply this selection as a mask to our hat layer. So let's turn our hat layer back on just by rechecking the checkbox. Left clicking on the brown rectangle. You can see that layer is now turned blue, indicating that layer is selected. Now because we selected the hat layer and it is a solid color, any changes we make to the color tab will affect that color. For instance, if I now select blue, you can see the layer turns blue, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to press Control and Z now to undo that. It's important here that we switch to our brush tool. So I'm going to select the brush tool, which is the 10th icon down on the left toolbar. Now if we press D on our keyboard, you can see our colours return to default, but the brown has remained brown. Okay, we're now going to add a mask to this layer using this selection. And to do this, we're going to go to our layers palette, and we're going to click on the little white box with the black circle. So just left click, and that creates a mask. You can see here we've got a mask next to our hat layer, and also the colours are now being restricted to the waistcoat and the hat we selected earlier. So we press Ctrl and D to remove the marching ants. We can see we've applied our first colour to our image. Okay, we can now move on to the shirt, and in this case John's got a denim shirt on, so we want to create a denim colour. So to do that, I'm just going to press X on my keyboard to switch to my primary white colour, and I'm going to double click that white circle, and I'm going to use my selector at the top of the colour chooser and just get to a rough area of denim colour. I can now drag my mouse around. So I think that looks kind of denim to me, and once we're happy we can just press close. Okay, we can return to our shape tool, and we know the first one selected is a rectangle tool, so we just left click that once, and then we can left click at the top of our image and drag. So keeping our finger on the left mouse button, we can drag our denim colour over our image. As we did before, we're going to change the blend mode, clicking on the normal drop down and scrolling down to soft light, revealing the image beneath. And we can left click on the text and rename that layer shirt. Press enter, and we can turn that layer off, and we can return to our background layer, and we can use the selection brush just by left clicking on the toolbar, increase our brush size, and we can start making a selection of John's shirt. But rather than bore you with this process again, I'm just going to press Ctrl and D to get rid of that selection. I'm going to go to select, load selection from file, and I'm going to open up the shirt selection I made earlier. Okay, with that selection live, I'm now going to left click on the shirt layer, recheck that checkbox, and we're going to apply a mask. So left click on the little white box with the black circle. That's created a mask on our shirt layer, and you can see now that the colour has only been applied now to John's shirt. So I press Ctrl and D to deselect that. First thing I notice here is that the blue is a little bit harsh. So I'm going to left click now on the shirt layer. Make sure you don't click on the mask layer, we want to click on the shirt layer. This is indicated by the white bounding box. And if we look at the opacity drop down, we can just left click on that drop down and move a slider to the left, and that reduces the opacity of that colour, and that looks a little bit more natural to me. So once we're happy with that, we can click outside our image to close that. So the first thing I notice here is that the buttons here have been coloured blue, and I wanted them to be white. Just need to left click on our mask on our shirt layer, ensuring our mask is selected. You can see that with the black bounding box. We also want to make sure that black is selected as our colour, because we're going to be painting on to conceal. So I'm going to zoom in on this button using Control and the scroll wheel on the mouse. I'm just going to paint black onto my mask, just to reveal the white of that button. And I press the space bar for my hand tool. I'm going to drag down to the next button, and again I'm just going to paint black onto my mask to conceal that blue. Okay, press Ctrl and 0. I can see here there's 2 more buttons on John's collar. So I press Ctrl and scroll just to zoom in. Reduce my brush size slightly because it's a smaller button here. And just paint black onto my mask just to allow that white to shine through. Drag across to the other collar and repeat. Just paint black onto my mask. And Ctrl and 0 to zoom out. So now we can address John's face. Now his skin is a little bit different. We're going to use a slightly different method. And in this case, we're going to use a gradient map. So ensuring our top layer is selected, I'm going to click on this little white and black circle again, just to select a new adjustment. So left click, and we're going to go to gradient map. And John turns all psychedelic on us. Okay, but not to worry. Looking at the gradient map, we've got 3 tones. We've got shadows, midtones, and highlights. But I want to add some extra tones to this image just to make it look that bit more natural. And to do this, I'm going to left click on the shadow node, and I'm going to click on insert. You can see we've now got a node which has been added at position 25%. And I'm going to left click on the midtone node, and I'm going to click insert. And we've now got one added at 75%. Now, you're probably thinking these colours aren't really flesh coloured, and you'd be quite right. Now, you can left click on each of these nodes, and you can left click on the colour tab, and you can add any colour you want. So we could potch around and try and find a nice deep shadowy flesh colour. But there is an easier method thanks to the internet. And I'm going to go to the internet now, and we're going to be looking at a website called colorhex.com. And if you go to color palettes, you can actually select skin tones. So if you type in skin in the search engine and just enter, it brings up a nice selection of skin tones for you to choose from. And if you left click on either of these, it gives you a PNG of that palette. And if you just right click, you can save that image to your drive. Now I've already done this. If I return to Affinity Photo, you can see here's a skin tone palette I've selected. It's a tanned skin tone because I remember John having quite tan skin. So if I press Ctrl and A, that selects all of the palette, and then press Ctrl and C to copy. I can return to the image of John. I can press Ctrl and V, and that pastes the palette in the top left corner of John's photo. Now if I return to the gradient map, just by double clicking that layer to bring up our gradient map tool, I can now left click on the shadow tone, left click on the color tab, and in the top right corner of the color tab you see this little picker tool. Now if I left click on that and drag, you can see I get this magnifying glass. So keep your finger on the mouse button and drag. You can drag it over this first shadow color. And once you're over the shadow color, just let go of the mouse button. And you can see this little circle next to the picker tool has turned brown. And once I'm happy with that selection, I can just click on this circle and it's applied to my color tab. So I left click on the gradient map tool. You can see my shadow color tone has now changed to this dark brown. So we can move to the next one along, the 25% node, left click, and then left click on the color tab, left click on the picker and drag to our next darkest color, which is this second bar across. I'm happy with the selection, so left click that circle and it's applied to my 25% node. So let's do the others. Let's click on the midtone, left click the color tab, left click and drag the picker to the midtone color. Happy with the selection, left click, apply. And let's move to the next. Left click on the color tab, left click on the picker and drag to the last but one, which is this pinky coloured one. I'm happy that selection's correct, so left click and that's now been applied. And let's do the final highlight. So left click the highlight node, left click the colour tile, left click the colour picker, and we're going to drag to this last bright pink colour on the left. I'm happy that selection's been made correctly. Left click the circle to apply, and we can see now we've got dark skin tones all the way through to highlight skin tones. And whilst we're here, we might as well change to blend mode. You can see here next to blend mode, we've got a drop down menu. So just left click on that, and we're going to select soft light. And we've now got the skin tone applied to John's photo. Okay, we can close down the gradient map. We can also left click on the color palette layer because we no longer need that, and just press delete. And now it's a case of making a selection of John's face again as we did before. So we can turn off our gradient map, return to our background layer, open up our selection brush tool by pressing W or selecting it by clicking the left toolbar. And again, we can just left click and make a selection of John's face. And as I've done before, I've made a selection previously. So in true Blue Peter style, I'm going to press Ctrl and D, select, load selection from file, and I've got John's skin. But you can take as much time as you like refining your selection for your image. Okay, once we've got our selection open, we can now left click on our gradient map layer, recheck the checkbox just to turn it back on again. And now we're going to add a mask. So it's going to left click on our mask layer icon, and you can see we've now added a mask to our image. So if I press Ctrl and D to remove the marching ants, you can see we've now applied the flesh color to John's face. And again, we can left click on the gradient layer, and we can go to the opacity slider and drag that to the left and to the right just to get a color balance that we're happy with. Another thing we can also do is if we double click the gradient map layer, brings up the gradient map tool, we can also tweak these nodes just to adjust the shade of each color. So once you're happy, we can just close that down. Okay, I'm now going to left click on the text of that layer and just call it skin. Right, next we're going to address the color of John's eyes, and to do this we're going to add another rectangle tool, but we're going to use a slightly different method. So just left click on the rectangle tool, and this time I'm just going to drag it so that it covers both of John's eyes instead of the whole image. And you'll notice here that the rectangle is white, but not to worry, you just need to click on the little white color circle on our color palette, double click to open up our color chooser, and John's eyes were blue, so I'm just going to drag this color selector over my blue tones, and I can drag inside this square using the color tile up here as reference as I drag to find a suitable color blue, and I think that will do the job. So just press close, and you can see now that the rectangle is turned blue. Again, as we did before, we need to change the blend mode, so click on the normal tab, scroll down to soft light, and we can now see John's eyes beneath. Okay, making sure our eye layer is selected, we can left click in the text and call that eyes, press enter, and we can add a mask. So again, click on the mask layer icon at the bottom of the layers palette to add a blank mask. Now because the whole mask is white, we can still see the whole of a rectangle. So in this case, we're going to press Ctrl and I on our keyboard. And what that does, it inverts the white to black. So instead of revealing all, it now hides all. Okay, if we zoom in by pressing the Control on our keyboard and using the scroll wheel of our mouse, we can turn on our brush tool by pressing B on our keyboard or selecting from the left. And if we note on the color palette, our default colors aren't showing. We've got black and blue. So we press D, return that to default. And because I want to reveal the blue color beneath the mask, we need to be using white. So just press X on our keyboard to switch between black and white on our color palette. We've now got white selected. I want to left click on a mask just to make sure that's selected as indicated by the black bounding box. And now we can start painting over John's irises. Just to bring in the blue. So I'm just left clicking and painting white onto my mask, and it's revealing the blue beneath. Now the pupils obviously don't need to be colored blue. So if we press X to switch back to black, and now I'm going to reduce my brush size, and I'm going to paint black onto my mask, just to mask out those pupils. And if I press Control and 0 on my keyboard to zoom out, you're probably thinking, wow, that's kind of intense. So again, if we left click on the actual eye layer, and you can see that's selected by the white bounding box, we can now click on the opacity slider again and just reduce the opacity of that color to blend it in. Okay, and that looks a lot more natural. Okay, we can now look at coloring the background, and in this case I'm going to color the background a color that complements John's shirt. And to do this, I'm going to use my color picker on a color palette. It's going to left click the color picker and drag over a mid-tone of John's denim shirt. And once I've selected, just let go. And now if I left click on the circle next to the color picker, it's applied to as my primary color. And now if I double click that, looking at the color chooser, you can see here we've got a little hashtag, and this gives us a little hex code. And this hex code is a code relating to that exact color. And what I'm going to do is going to left click in there, and it turns blue. I'm going to press Control and C to copy. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to go to the internet again. And I'm going to go to a website which is created by Adobe called Adobe Color. So it's color.adobe.com/create/color wheel. And this is quite a useful tool for all those interested in color science. But just to keep things simple, in this case, I'm going to click on complementary. And what that does is allows us to identify colors and their complementary colors. So for instance, if I drag round to orange, the complementary color of orange is cyan. And again, if I drag round to magenta, the complementary color of magenta is green. But in our case, we want to get a complementary color for the denim of John's shirt. And if we scroll down slightly, halfway, you can see one of these squares has got a little triangle, and that's the base color that's being used to create these complementary colors. And if we double click on this hex code beneath that square, it turns blue. I'm going to press Control and V just to paste the hex code that we took from Affinity and press Enter. And you can see now that's my base color, and we're presented with various complementary colors that we can use in our photos. In this case, I quite like this lighter brown rather than a dark brown. So I'm just going to left click and drag over that hex code, press Control and C. I'm going to return to Affinity, and you can see the color chooser is still open and the hex code is still highlighted. I'm going to press Control and V and press Enter. And you can see now the color tile has changed to the color that we selected on the Adobe site. So I can just press Close. And now that color is my primary color. I can go to the rectangle tool again, left click, and this time I'm going to drag over the entirety of my image and let go. We're going to change that blend mode to soft light as we did before. I'm going to left click on the text and call that wall. Enter. We can switch that layer off for now, and we can return to our background layer, and we can make a selection again using our selection brush, which is W, a shortcut, and paint in our background just to select that. Again, earlier I made a more accurate selection. So if I press Control and D to delete that, I've got to select Load Selection from File and double click on Background. Okay, so I've got my background selection made. I can now turn on my wall, left click on my wall layer, and left click on the mask layer to add my mask. I'll press Control and D to get rid of those marching ants. And again, we can left click on the actual wall layer itself. You can see the white bounding box to show it's selected, and we can click on the opacity slider to increase and decrease the opacity of that color. But the color wheel has done its job. You can see the denim shirt and the background complement each other perfectly. Okay, Hopefully that's given you an insight into how you can colour black and white images within Affinity Photo. And it's also taught you a little bit about masks and creating shortcuts. I'm sorry it's quite a long-winded tutorial. There's a lot to get through. But if you did like the video, please give me a like below. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. And more importantly, as always, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.